My name is David Masur, and I'm the Executive Director for PennEnvironment. PennEnvironment is a citizen-based environmental watchdog group. We have about 150,000 members and online activists and volunteers all across Pennsylvania. I put up my email address here. If folks are not part of our network and want to get more information, please shoot me an email. This issue is something that strikes close to home for me, like many of the speakers here today. The photo you see here is a train derailment about a mile south of my house. I live in South Philadelphia. You can walk from my house to the oil refinery, which is the primary destination for most of the oil coming from the Bakken region to Philly, right down past Yonk Ave. For folks familiar with Philly, you can walk from my home to the refinery, and we have a lot of train traffic, and we heard there was a derailment earlier today. I'm going to work with Randy Sargent and talk about some of the forms of engagement we're trying to do to get people involved in our work, and specifically train counting, train spotting as it's been called. I'm going to talk about some of the ways we've involved our activists, and then turn over Randy to talk about some of the more high-tech things we've been doing. You'll see that I get to do the Luddite part of this section, and you may be able to experience that firsthand depending on how my slide projector changing goes here. But let me start by talking about why we are counting oil trains. As we've already heard, most states don't share the U.S. Department of Transportation data with the public, which obviously leaves us with a data gap. Number two, where the data does exist, it's often not that helpful. So you may know that in some cases here in the Commonwealth, train companies will tell the state, you know, we have 0 to 10 trains traveling through Pittsburgh on a certain day. That's not honestly that helpful to know who's at risk. I mean, I'm not a CMU brainiac like Randy, but even I can understand that concept. And in many cases, as you may know, if trains are carrying less than 1 million gallons, they don't have to report to the state at all. So huge gaps in reporting. The last point here is, of course, we would argue you need the facts to be able to decide what the actual problem is, what's the solution we need, and what strategies do we need to implement to tackle those problems. So that was sort of where we started when Frac Tracker and Randy at CMU and PennEnvironment started this conversation. And we came up with a set of goals we thought were really crucial when trying to tackle this. And they cover, I think, a pretty broad spectrum. So for PennEnvironment, as a citizen-based group, you know, one of the main things was giving people an opportunity to get engaged civically around issues they care about. As Kathy mentioned, I thought it was a really good point that people are frustrated, and, you know, Kathy said they need channels to properly engage in this issue. And we thought giving people the opportunity to get involved in the train counting activity and sort of say, you know what, look, if officials won't give us the information, you know, damn it, we'll just go out and we'll collect it ourselves, and that people want to be part of that movement and start to collect that data. So first from the spectrum of organizing was just give people the opportunity to engage. Secondly, we wanted to use it to build a bigger and better movement when it comes to tackling oil trains, but fossil fuel issues and environmental and community issues in general. We really thought this could be a gateway that concerned citizens could get involved. They could get involved in the train counting, and that would really allow us to build a better network and community of activists, that we could build leadership within our communities and environmental movement, and have a ladder for activism and leadership at the same time. Again, for the third bullet here is, you know, we just felt like the more we know, the better off we are, so we just need to have more data at our fingertips, and train counting would get that for us. Fourth, we really thought once we can get to a critical mass on data, it also helps us have opportunities for more visibility and more media coverage. It's sort of come up a couple of times today that when you talk to people about oil trains, they may not know what you're talking about. They may live nearby and not know this threat exists. And the more opportunities we have to get media, tell a rich story, and keep this on the front burner, we thought train counting and the data we collect will help us tell stories to do that. And then lastly, to really help leverage decision makers and corporations, elected officials, and regulators to do better to protect our communities. We heard this earlier on one of the panels. I think Fred Millar, made a great case that, this issue of terrorism is such a red herring. The more we can show that that is, the emperor has no clothes. We know where these trains are. Many first responders will tell you, we'd have to have the dumbest terrorists on the planet not to be able to find where these are. And we think the more we can just, show the emperor has no clothes by getting this data in one place is helpful and forces their hand to get to the real substance of the debate. So what we did and how it works, and I should say that Sam Malone from Frac Tracker, I think, deserves, honestly, a ton of the credit because she sort of drove a lot of this process, is step one is we designed and created a set of materials that would be easy for concerned citizens to use and go out like 1,000 flowers blooming organically to go out and count trains in their community as they see fit. And we designed a set of materials, we sort of tested them, road tested them, made sure they made sense and worked, shared them with concerned citizens to get their feedback, and came up with a template of materials which we can share with anyone who's interested if you'd like to do this in your own community. Number two, we went out and recruited volunteers. We picked locations across the Commonwealth to do the train counting. And then lastly, we wanted to come up with really a smooth and fast and easy way to train up volunteers to do this in a concise way, have consistency, and we did that a few ways. We did some on-site training. Volunteers would show up at the tracks. We'd show them how to do the train counting, use the materials. We also ran like a Google chat. Again, as the Luddite, I couldn't really give you too much detail. Sam ran a cool Google chat training with a bunch of people from all over Pennsylvania who could all get together and go through the training online together. So that was sort of the basics. It wasn't really rocket science, and I think it came out with a good product. Here's some photos of a couple of folks. You may recognize my friend Brooke Lenker from Frac Tracker right there. Sorry, Brooke. I should have gotten his sign off to use that. But these are a couple of photos. Two photos of people out actually doing the train counting on site, and a photo from the train counting process. And the way that this sort of worked and what we did basically is we ended up, we picked 5 sites, a couple in Pittsburgh, a couple in Philly, and one in Harrisburg. Like I said, we went out and recruited volunteers. All told, over the course of 2 days, we were able to get 32 volunteers to come out, each doing 3-hour shifts. So we basically were able to get about 150 volunteer hours and do 10 to 12-hour days. So folks would start at about 8 in the morning and go till 6 or 8 at night. Over the 2 days, we counted 3,100 train cars. About 200 were oil trains. We have the tick sheets. We also, one of the parts that I thought was the coolest, by the way, and Matt Kelso and I have a little debate about this, Matt from Frac Tracker, but we also got radar guns, and we would then, that's, who doesn't want to sit there with the radar gun, right, pointing at the train? That was my favorite part, again. Trying to get data about the speed, are they complying with set speed limits on certain parts of the tracks? And then at the end, all the volunteers could upload the data centrally to a Google Doc, so then we could centralize it and tabulate it. Let's see, I think the last thing, and then I will turn it over to Randy for the more high-tech pieces. This was like a beta test. I mean, this was the first time sort of rolling it out soup to nuts. And I think we learned a bunch of things. I think mostly it went quite well. The people who did it really enjoyed it, felt like they were making a difference. But of course, anytime you do a test, one of the cool things is you learn things. Some things work, some don't. A couple of the takeaways we had were, number one, just needing to improve and hone our story. And one of the things here that came up on the back end was, all of us sit around, we talk about oil trains, pervasive. I mean, you go outside, you trip over, they're like everywhere. I mean, you can't not see an oil train. But when you're sitting there at a track for like a 6-hour block, you may or may not see any oil trains. And so I think one of the things we learned is we have to probably tell a story that's a little more conservative, under promise, and hopefully over deliver, because if people came back after doing 3, 6, some cases 9 hours and didn't see any trains, they sort of felt like the story that they had heard on the front end and their experience didn't always match up. So how do we make sure that we're telling the right story and setting expectations for volunteers for the experience? Number 2 is creating efficiencies to get more product. So on our train counting, we had folks do it in groups of 3. So you'd have someone counting the placards for oil train cars, you'd have someone counting other cars, and you'd have someone with the, as I already mentioned, awesome radar gun. But of course, if we could, instead of having 3 people for 1 hour, have doing it together, create 3 separate hours and collect more data, efficiency would be better. And then there's a whole set of logistical challenges, some which we knew on the front end, and you saw them maybe if I go back to the picture, things like weather. So you'll notice someone here came planned with a tent, ingenious, as well as Dunkin' Donuts coffee, I think there. But things like weather, how close you can get to the track and public space to actually read the placards, and in some cases having local officials, who are wondering why you're pointing a giant gun-looking thing at trains, oil trains running by, come and ask you what you're doing and ask you probably to stop doing it. In Philly, one of the big challenges was we happened to do this on the hottest week of the summer where the heat index was over 100 degrees. So you can imagine standing out in mostly unshaded areas for hours on end they were hardworking volunteers, shall we say. So with that, I will turn it over to Randy Sargent from CMU.